which is being organized by the International Labour Organization, the ILO, in collaboration with the government of Switzerland. My name is Shahra Razavi, and I'm the director of the Social Protection Department at the ILO, and I will be moderating the event. We will be opening the session now with remarks from three distinguished panelists. I would like to call on Mr. Adrian Howry, Deputy Permanent Representative of Switzerland to the United Nations, to deliver his welcoming remarks. Over to you now, Mr. Howry.
Thank you so much, Shahra. Very good morning or afternoon, dear colleagues and participants to this side event. On behalf of the government of Switzerland, I would like to welcome you all very much and warmly, and I wish you an excellent day and good discussions. We're opening this side event on social protection floors for a just transition to the green and digital economy. And maybe I would start here on a positive note. The pandemic has accelerated digitalization in all aspects of our daily lives. As you can see, as we have found ourselves now again on cyberspace having this event, it also opened up new opportunities for a greener economy. And these are important topics also of the current CSocD, including this 59th session of the Commission for Social Development. The green and digital transition will certainly stimulate new employment, but during times of crisis and rapid change, social protection floors will and remain critical to mitigate the social consequences in order to leave no one behind. As an apparent example, think of our highly appreciated and respected essential and frontline workers and just how they themselves, while protecting us, may be part of the group of the most vulnerable people facing exploitation. The pandemic has disrupted labor markets on a massive scale. According to ILO's estimates, losses of working hours in 2020 were approximately 4 times higher than during the global financial crisis in 2009. To improve labor markets' resilience, we need to strengthen institutions. And this is particularly true for social protection systems. Implementing such policies requires governments, which have access to the necessary finance, to use and direct these means efficiently. For developing countries alone, the annual financing gap for social protection is at 1.2 trillion US dollars. So today, as we convene representatives from different governments, from the private sector, from trade unions and other stakeholders, I invite you all to engage in a fruitful and a good discussion how to implement social protection floors to protect people and the planet. Social protection floors can reduce vulnerabilities and they can protect those impacted by the digital and green transformation. But we must overcome the financing gap in order to do so. With these few words, I wish you all a very constructive and fruitful exchange and a very productive day. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Howry, for your opening remarks. It's now my pleasure to invite our next speaker, Mrs. Colette Roberts-Risdon, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Labour and Social Affairs from Jamaica, to take the floor. You have the floor, Ms. Risdon.
Thank you very much. Let me first express appreciation for us being afforded this opportunity and this side event. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to rewrite the future of work and accelerate the digital economy. Jamaica, through various programs and initiatives, has been doing its part to ensure that we respond to the needs of our labor force and the most vulnerable in our society. In an effort to build an adaptive system to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience, the government of Jamaica introduced the ReCare and Special Emergency Relief programs, costing the government over $15 billion. These programs provided support to displaced workers, businesses in the tourism sectors, and others that have been negatively impacted by the economic downturn. In the early days of the pandemic, the government encouraged social dialogue between workers and employers to work together to ensure their survivability. Businesses were asked to create ways of keeping workers employed or to provide a social protection floor through a minimum level of income for temporarily displaced workers. Workers were encouraged to be flexible and to adapt in these unprecedented times. The two major or Jamaica's largest social protection programs in Jamaica, the Program of Advancement through Health and Education, and our national pension systems, were forced to adapt. Before the global-19 pandemic, a general initiative was undertaken to infuse technology as a primary driver of modernization. While the transition was slow before, the pandemic has certainly hastened our actions. The need to safeguard the population of pensioners and other welfare beneficiaries from the novel virus catapulted the drive to transition the majority of our existing pensioners and beneficiaries from paper to electronic payments. The pandemic has seen a reduction in face-to-face interaction with customers permitted by many of our major financial institutions. Efforts were therefore intensified to transition clients to electronic payment methods. Social assistance payments or welfare payments saw us moving from 14% to 33%, and our pension payments moving from 20% to 53% using electronic or digital means. The digitization drive is a vehicle that will enable a faster response to customers, which will ultimately redound in our improvement. In terms of the social assistance and our welfare programs, we have automated many of our applications and approval processes. While still a work in progress, the synergy created by these initiatives have resulted in significant speed at which workers in Jamaica are able to access benefits. In an effort to ensure inclusiveness in our labor force, the government provided online training to reskill and upskill persons with disabilities so that they can be efficient in this changing and dynamic labor force. However, Chair, these rapid digital transformation of our economies and lives, while enabling us to respond and continue during the pandemic, has created other challenges. The increased loneliness, frustration, and hopelessness, increased levels of mental illnesses, such as depression, increased domestic and other violence in the societies, are issues we have to begin to address in a more concrete way. The pandemic is taking much longer than we anticipated. And so the social dialogue that the government encouraged in the early days, unfortunately, many are now beginning to get restless. Our economies are stretched, unemployment is rising, our health systems are breaking, the learning of our children is and has been negatively affected. The economic impact on our economies and the financial burden on our governments, who more than ever are being asked to provide or ensure a minimum social protection floor, requires us to rethink and find creative and new solutions as we seek to protect and ensure all of our survivability in these changing times. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Risden, for your remarks. And I'm sorry that during your presentation, we were not able to see you. There was a technical problem. I hope that we won't have this problem as we move on to our next speaker. And it gives me immense pleasure at this point to introduce to you Ms. Valérie Berset-Bircher, who's the ambassador from the Federal Department of Economic Affairs, Education and Research, State Secretariat of Economic Affairs, Labour Directorate, International Labour Affairs of Switzerland. Ms. Berset-Bircher, you have the floor. Thank you.
Director, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking the ILO for the collaboration in organizing today's event during the 59th session of the Commission for Social Development, and I have the honor to set the scene before experts take the floor. The ILO marked its centenary at a time of transformative change in the world of work, driven by technological innovation, demographic shifts, climate change, and globalization, which have profound impacts on the future and the nature of work. For these reasons, Switzerland supported the ILO Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work in 2019. It provides guidance on how to address these issues and offers a platform for collaboration with other organizations in the international system. This declaration is the result of tripartite dialogue at national and international level. It envisions a people-centered future of work and looks at the major challenges and opportunities ranging from technology to climate change, from demographic shift to the need for new skills. Now, what means a human-centered approach to the future of work? It means investing in jobs, skills, and social protection. And this is even more the case today in time of crisis. It also means investing in the institution of the labor market and adopting policies that promote an enabling environment for sustainable enterprises, economic growth, and decent work for all. Our main objective is to ensure the highest possible participation in the workforce and a good quality of employment, including in the digital age. We believe that the essential factors for successfully managing structural change are a flexible labor market regulation with a well-functioning social partnership and active labor market policies. The COVID-19 crisis has turned our lives and our economy upside down. The COVID-19 pandemic is still causing immense suffering and exposing the extreme vulnerability of millions of workers and enterprises. Women are particularly affected, and this is internationally well known and well dated now. The pandemic has also an impact on labor standards, like, for example, freedom of association, trade union rights, workers' rights, and protection. The ILO has taken action through policy analysis and recommendation, dissemination of information, and international collaboration to share, design, and implement effective measures to reduce the impact of COVID-19 on labor markets and economies. Different observatories have been published and recommendations for stimulating the economy and employment, supporting enterprises, jobs and incomes, protecting workers in the workplace, and using social dialogue have been published. Let me insist today on one key point. Nobody can deny that social protection is very much needed in times of crisis. I would like to share some information about the Swiss extension of the social protection coverage during the crisis, and also recognize that we are very lucky to have a long-standing social protection system already in place. Switzerland has not been spared by the impacts of the pandemic and therefore made an extension of the social protection coverage during the crisis. There are two principles that have helped Switzerland and a lot in managing this crisis. First, it is crucial to invest in social safety net that left no one behind. Our unemployment insurance has been a stabilizer in addition to the classic right to unemployment. Companies that temporarily have no work can claim compensation for their employees. The employees keep their jobs and the company avoids bankruptcy. During the crisis, the right to short-time working was extended to new categories of workers as well as in the duration. This was not enough to protect people. In addition, we have created a compensation scheme for loss of income for self-employed people, something totally new in Switzerland. Second principle, investing in social dialogue. This is essential. The Swiss government intensified this discussion during the coronavirus crisis. In order to ensure health and safety at work, health protection plans have been drawn by the various branches of the economy. The extension of the social security net was also regularly discussed with social partners. I'm therefore very pleased today to see that we have at this table our international social partners for the discussion. Finally, the post-COVID-19 area will be shaped with more technology, and non-traditional forms of work will probably continue to rise. We do need to adapt our existing social protection institution in order not to exclude people. Each country has to find its way. The lack of access to social security has manifested itself very hardly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Many workers have been left with no income, and to combat this, some measures have been extended universally to all workers. They are temporarily, and they present an opportunity to maybe revisit our current social system and develop an inclusive one that protects all workers in a systematic and enduring manner. Finally, part of the answer lies, as I said at the beginning, in the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work of the ILO, which commits to us to ensure protection for all workers, promote sustainable economic growth, full employment and decent work, and enabling everyone to benefit from changes in the world of work. Together, we must do all we can to ensure that this crisis leads to a more sustainable and fairer model of society, capable of adapting to future challenges. And I'm very much looking forward to the experts that will share with us new ways of thinking about our social protection system. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bercier-Bircher, for your remarks. And I'm now very pleased, having heard our three distinguished speakers, having delivered their opening remarks. I'm very pleased to give you a brief outline of how we're going to be proceeding today. First of all, I don't need to say it, but I will reiterate that the overall intention of the discussion that we will be having today with the experts and with you, the public, is to establish through very different perspectives that we bring to this discussion and with very concrete examples from diverse parts of the world, that social protection systems must be part of climate action. Social protection systems are an enabler of the kind of transitions that people need to make, economies need to make, to more sustainable economic arrangements. In order to make those transitions just, inclusive, and to avoid the kind of conflicts and tensions that arise when people are left behind in the process of change, we really need to see significant investments in social protection systems. And therefore, it's absolutely essential to advocate for stronger synergies and to be able to fill the gaps in social protection systems by mobilizing adequate resources in order for all countries to be able to invest in social protection systems that are inclusive and that reach the entire population. I also want to remind the panel that the public and the panelists that the theme of our discussion today is really in line with the discussions that are taking place around the priority theme resolution of the Commission for Social Development, which is to promote social security systems supportive of the transition to greener economies and to societies that are much more resilient to shocks. Now, COVID-19 was one shock that we are still going through, and this has made it clear to us that in many parts of the world, there is still huge gaps in social protection systems that need to be addressed. and really has raised the urgency of making the necessary investments so that we are, as a global society, better prepared for future shocks and much more resilient to the kind of shocks that we will be experiencing. Let me just add that the panel that we're organizing today and you will be hearing is composed of two components, if I can say. One that is going to be focused on solutions and partnerships, and then a second part that will highlight the perspective of employers and workers in this process of making a just transition. A very important set of voices to be heard, as several of our opening remarks also refer to the importance of social dialogue in really enabling and making transitions just. I also want to just highlight that there will be an interactive discussion part to the panel today, and the public will be invited to submit their questions in advance through the question and answer function. There's a Q&A function that you will find at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your questions to us. I will then be asking and calling on members who have submitted questions to individually post their questions live during the panel, and then I will invite our panelists to respond to the questions. If your question is being addressed at a specific speaker, please do mention it. If it's a more general question that you would like any of the panelists to respond to, then you don't need to specify a specific name. I also would like to inform you that the session is being recorded today, and that later it will be uploaded on UN Web TV and also possibly other platforms. So please do take note of this. Looking at time, I think we are very well placed now to move into panel one, the panel that will be focusing on solutions and partnerships. Here again, it really gives me great pleasure to introduce and invite Ms. Eileen O'Donovan, who is the Social Protection Policy Lead in Irish Aid, to respond to a question that I would like to pose to her. Ms. Donovan, if I can address the question to you. As you will recall, you took part in the ILO Global Social Protection Week that took place at the end of 2019. It seems like a very long time ago. And during that session that you were participating in, you expressed the conviction, and I'm quoting you here, that we must scale up existing systems. Investing in national systems that are locally owned allows for broader coverage, better capacity for analysis and early planning, and helps to better identify those who are lagging behind. So now, more than a year later, and after we have all been through this very painful COVID crisis, and thinking about the future crisis posed by climate change that we can all see on the horizon, if not already here in many countries. Do you still feel the same way? And can you please elaborate on what you said? So over to you.
Thank you very much. I think it's critical now more than ever to invest in social protection systems. I think it's important to start by stating that social protection is a right, and social protection along the life cycle is universal social protection is what we should all be aspiring towards. However, as well, social protection is a really important policy instrument to respond to poverty and inequality, and to support inclusive growth, and boost human capital, domestic demand, and also facilitate structural transformation of national economies. What we've seen with COVID is a huge uptake of social protection responses across the globe. According to the ILO Social Protection Monitor, 1,596 social protection measures were implemented or announced by 209 countries by the end of November last year. Social protection, the momentum is really behind social protection. So it's really around how do we take this further and sustain that momentum to build much more resilient communities. I think the case around social protection, for us, it's really around investing in order to deliver results. So along education, health, and nutrition, investing in social protections will develop stronger and more resilient communities, and thus it's an important investment. For us in our policy for international development, our commitment's really around reaching those furthest behind, and we know that those who are most vulnerable are also vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and we're seeing a recurrent in climate shocks, and as a result, intensification in vulnerability. So it's really critical to ensure that social protection responses are effectively designed to take into mitigating climate impact and supporting adaptation. We know for a fact that by investing in social protection, it's an effective and efficient way of reducing vulnerability. I'd like to highlight three sort of critical areas in terms of investing in social protection systems. It's a lot more cost effective than annual responses to humanitarian crisis. So supporting inclusive social protection systems and also investing in adaptive social protection systems. So systems that are able to horizontally scale up in terms of increasing caseload, but also in terms of improving on the benefits that need to be allocated in terms of the needs at a country. I think it's also really critical to note that social protection systems must be designed with the context in mind in order that they're able to respond to the needs in that particular context. And also to ensure that there's sustainable national mechanism in order to finance the social protection response. So I think to conclude my contribution, I think we're at the point in time where there's momentum behind social protection. We need to take it forward. And we need to, in a sense, make sure that the investing in social protection systems are a long national investment. So not only in programs, but the targeting, the information management systems, the accountability mechanism, and the financing is coherent. And that social protection policies and strategies and programs are speaking to other sectors. So just to conclude, I think we should fall behind inclusive, adaptive, and sustainable social protection systems and really move the agenda forward as we strive to deliver 2030 SDG 2030 objectives, and that national governments, as long as international solidarity is really required to make this transition into a more green and digital economy. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ms. Radovan, for your very interesting and in many ways, I would say, uplifting presentation, highlighting both the human rights imperatives of social protection as well as the social, economic, and environmental payoffs of investing in social protection systems, as you said, and really building on the current momentum that has been generated by the crisis to bring in the kind of necessary resources that are needed for investments in cohesive, responsive, and adaptive social protection systems that can stand us in good stead in the context of forthcoming crises and the need for the kind of transitions that are needed to more sustainable economies and societies. I think you have provided a very interesting call to action for the panel, and I now have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Sunia Ore who's the Director of Technical Services of the National Drought Management Authority of Kenya, to our panel. Thank you, Mr. Ore, for having joined us. And I have a question that I would like to pose, which really addresses, hopefully allows you to elaborate on some of your very valuable experience in Kenya. Particularly your field experience with the National Drought Management Authority and social protection programs, such as, for example, the Hunger and Safety Net program in Kenya. If you could please give us some concrete examples of how it's possible to bring together climate adaptation and social protection mechanisms, how you've done it in Kenya. I'm sure it hasn't been easy, but maybe you can tell us a bit about the key benefits that have come from having brought these two elements together, and perhaps just highlight one or two of the challenges that you have faced. So over to you, Mr. Ore. Thank you very much for responding to our question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Zara, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to share briefly the background and the context within which we operate climate-sensitive social protection. Kenya is prone to climate shocks, particularly droughts, and particularly women, children, pastoralists are the most vulnerable. And in the past, the National Treasury, the development partners have been working mainly responding to shocks once they have occurred. The country found this unsustainable, and in 2011, there was a commitment, not just by the Kenyan head of state, but the IGAD region heads of state. This is a region which is vulnerable largely to droughts and also to floods because of the vulnerabilities of the populations. The Kenya government has several mechanisms, climate adaptation, drought response mechanisms, as well as which is also complemented by the social protection schemes. We have a number of social protection schemes targeting the life cycle, the vulnerable, often vulnerable children, the older persons, but none perhaps addressing some of the poor, the urban poor. But in the north, where climate change has really impacted on the communities and their livelihoods, we have a hunger safety net program, which is a shock responsive program. This program has two components: the regular cash transfers that cushions the very vulnerable, the very poor vulnerable households, and the shock responsive, or you may call it climate sensitive cash transfers. We have a mechanism, a robust early warning system with triggers, agreed upon triggers. And this early warning system and the agreed upon trigger, which is scientific, which is vegetation condition index, enables us to respond at the right time. How does the shock responsive mechanism complement other schemes? We have, for example, the index-based livestock insurance, which is a risk transfer. We have the hunger safety net program. We have registered, we do register all the households. We rank them based on their vulnerabilities and predetermine based on the drought index to what extent do we expand or constrict our cash transfers. It therefore complements The other mechanisms, including investments in water sector, agricultural sector, and other mechanisms, in that usually during disasters, droughts, floods, households will resort towards depleting the assets because the priority is saving lives and livelihoods. This allows them, protects them from depleting those assets which they need at all times. There are challenges that needs to be addressed, which I will address it in a way of a challenge and also a solution. For our shock responsive cash transfer to be effective, there has to be an earmark resources in the context of climate vulnerabilities. To do this, perhaps you might need to have a risk-layered approach where you have contingent planning, contingent financing, as well as risk transfers. And in Kenya, we have developed the two mechanisms. There's also need to institutionalize. Institutionalizing shock responsive cash transfers is not easy because it requires a policy framework, the legal frameworks, and high-level champions. So institutionalizing shock responsive cash transfers might actually, particularly in developing countries, require support from partners in that most times developing nations may not have resources to pilot those mechanisms. There has also to be an infrastructure that will allow prompt response, prompt cash transfers. In order to, in the long run, reduce the need for cash transfers, there has to be an investment in long-term resilience. So in summary, the key issues that a nation must have in order to have a workable, robust, shock responsive mechanisms is a good early warning system, an infrastructure, an infrastructure for transfer, which in our case is bank accounts opening for all the beneficiaries that are likely to be affected by drought, and a predetermined strategy on how to respond. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Mr. Ore, for giving us such a useful overview of the work that is being carried out and highlighting both some of the main sort of advantages of having a system in place so that households in the context of shocks are not forced to resort to harmful coping mechanisms like depleting their assets. And at the same time, you also, I think, raised some really important questions about the extent to which countries are able to institutionalize these social protection systems with strong administrative systems in place, anchored in laws and strategies, and having the kind of political voice to be able to allocate the necessary resources, earmarking of resources, and the need sometimes for external support to be able to pilot some of these frameworks, perhaps before convincing countries that they should be allocating sufficient resources and investments to the area of social protection. I hope these are some of the issues that we will turn to later as well with some of our other speakers. If I can just take a minute to please ask our colleagues who are online and listening to the discussion to put in their questions into the Q&A function that is available. it would be really good to get a lively discussion going at the end of hearing all the presentations. So please put in your questions and we will go through them and then bring them to the attention of the panelists. I will now move on to our next speaker, Ms. Katharina Diekmann, who's the technical advisor on social protection in the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit, GIZ. It gives me great pleasure, Ms. Diekmann, to have you here on the panel. And I know that you have quite an extensive experience in the area of social protection, and you have undertaken a number of studies on social protection in the context of a warming world. So I would like to ask you what you feel should really be strengthened further or done differently if we're not doing it correctly already, and what role do you see for international partners in building the foundations of a kind of climate sensitive, sustainable social protection strategies. If you could just reflect on your experience and your studies and give us your kind of top level messages in terms of what can be done more of and what can be done differently, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Over to you.
Right. Thanks, Yashara, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to make 4 points. The first one is on adaptive social protection systems, and I think Eileen has already elaborated about this before, so I will not go much into detail here. Just to strengthen again that these are really important systems that need to be developed further, and that are also one of Germany's priority to work with partner countries on. They need to withstand shocks and respond to shocks, but in addition to that, systems also should be set up in a way that they contribute to preventive measures. So I think the example that we heard from Sunya from Kenya just now on early warning systems linked to social protection systems are a very good example that goes exactly into that direction. And I think we need much more of that, and we need to learn from that, maybe from Kenya in that case, on how to do that well. I think international partners in general can support their partner countries in developing and adapting these systems technically and in some cases financially, and should rather do that than supporting scattered programs. My second point is that we need to look more at the role that social protection can play to contribute to climate change mitigation and a just transition. Because I think here we haven't done enough, we haven't learned enough, and we haven't understood enough what role social protection can play here. Just some examples. If we look at just transition, in the beginning, there will always be people who might be negatively affected by the change. Through subsidy reforms, through carbon pricing, through job losses. And these people need to be compensated, and especially if they are already the poorest and most vulnerable people. So here, cash transfers for informal workers and unemployment insurance for formal workers are key. I'm sure the next panel will go more into detail of that. But also just to say, this is something that the whole world needs to look at now. Germany, for example, has very big discussions on coal phase out. So it's something where we can work together and learn from each other. Further, we should look into how we can incentivize climate-friendly behavior amongst our beneficiaries more and actively contribute to climate change mitigation. I think payment for environmental services and public works programs that focus on environmental rehabilitation are good examples, and in some cases have proven substantial effects on reducing CO2 emissions. However, not always, and I think there is quite some lack of understanding and knowledge yet on how do they need to be designed to really contribute to CO2 emission reduction as well as to poverty reduction. So this is also something where international partners can come in, especially with research. But maybe we need to also look out a little bit of our routine way of thinking and need to think of new approaches. Just an example, why don't we look at geographical targeting options that link targeting to climate hazard maps, for example. But I think there are much more ideas that could be come out if we would work together and bring together the joint expertise of social protection, climate, and disaster risk management actors. Because I think just with one expertise, we will not come up with these ideas. We need to work together. Which leads me to my third point, coordination, which we all know is difficult. And here it might even be more difficult because we don't only need to coordinate among social protection actors, but with social protection actors, climate, DRM, and humanitarian actors. And it means not only social protection actors should consider climate risks, but also climate and disaster risk management actors need to acknowledge that social protection is part of the solution And this ideally needs to be enshrined in policy. From our experience, it is very important that all sectors work together from the onset when adapting or developing a new program or even an entire system. And I think Indonesia provides a very good example here, where we currently support the government to start by developing an adaptive social protection system with developing a roadmap on how to do that. And this roadmap is being done together by ministries responsible for development planning, for disaster risk management, for climate, social affairs, and finance jointly. So I think it's a very good example of such coordination efforts. In general, international partners can play a very strong role in coordination. We need to hold these discussions at the global level between the different sectors. And here, actually, we often need to start within our own organizations because we also work in sectors within our organizations. We might need to rethink funding logics. We need to coordinate amongst each other at country level in the countries that we work in, but ensure that the national governments remain in the driving seat. Lastly, let me come to my fourth point and last point, which I think were already mentioned by a number of speakers today, financing and sustainability. I think I can talk forever about financing, but let me focus here on climate financing and disaster risk financing, because I think this is a topic for today. And if we want to be positive, the first good news maybe is that if we invest in the systems now, if we prepare people better for shocks, and if we strengthen coordination to avoid duplications, this already will reduce the cost in the long term. However, I think we all know that financing will remain a challenge. And with a challenging post-COVID macroeconomic situation now, and the expected number of increased weather events, even more so. Therefore, it is positive that disaster risk financing is becoming increasingly important. There are already many disaster risk financing mechanisms in place that can be further strengthened and coordinated. And one aspect that we should look at especially should be to better link them to social protection systems and contingency plans in general to ensure quick payouts. And we need to support partner countries in identifying and accessing the right instruments. I think we heard something around this from Kenya just now as well, because there is still a gap in understanding which are the right instruments for which context and how to layer them correctly. One example, I think, that aims to do so and aims at supporting countries in their disaster risk financing strategies is the Ensure Resilience Global Partnership that Germany also strongly supports, and it aims at protecting 500 million poor and vulnerable people against climate risks. So climate finance in general offers huge potential for financing for social protection as well. But currently, I think the discussions on the role for social protection in addressing climate change does not yet go along with additional financing. So we really need to advocate for the ring fencing of finance to social protection that support climate objectives as well. And I think in that sense, disaster risk financing linked to social protection systems has a great potential. But to conclude, if we look at climate financing, we might also need to look at new ways of financing, think a little bit out of our usual box thinking, and consider other aspects. For example, looking at CO2 taxes. Why don't we use CO2 taxes to fund social protection systems, for example? This would also be fair in a just argument, because we know that climate change affects the most poorest and vulnerable people most, while at the same time they contributed very little to climate change. So just to call also to look at new ways of funding and doing things. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Ms. Dickman, for putting a number of really important issues on the table here, from the important work on mitigation to the need for coordination. And at this point, I think, and of course, ending with your very important remarks about financing and sources of financing for social protection systems, and the important question that you posed, why not CO2 taxes as one other important source of financing for social protection? And I think working out the mechanisms for that would be indeed very interesting to see how that can be put into action. If I take you up on the question around how to coordinate better, I think we are in a very good position now to introduce our next speaker, who is Mr. El Kabir Aloui, Deputy Resident Representative Program from UNDP Senegal. And I would say that Mr. Aloui, with 25 years of experience of international development and humanitarian experience in particular, for 18 years within the UN system, would be very well placed to pick up on those issues around coordination. So, Mr. Aloui, welcome to the panel. And could I ask you to kindly give us a concrete example of one of the programs that you have been overseeing, where there's an effort to really pull together social protection and climate change adaptation measures in Senegal, specifically to restore the Mbao forest, known to be the green lung of Dakar, and highlight for us briefly the core added value of this effort, of this program, and also some of the challenges that you have encountered in terms of the sustainability of the program. So I hand over to you, Mr. Aloui, for your remarks.
Thank you so much, and salam alaikum. I'm talking from Senegal with my baobab. So I'm gonna take, my presentation under the angle of the forest, under the angle of the issue of protecting the forest and the climate change adaptation, with the center, priority of social protection. Let me just maybe tell you about the story. The story is that we're working in the forest called Mbao forest, which is, as it was said, the green lung, the only green part that is surrounding the highly densely urbanized Dakar city, as you may know. It's actually at 800,000 hectares that are under a huge pressure of urbanization and degradation, which is exacerbated by the climate change effects. That forest, Mbao, is governed by a management plan, which is designed by the Ministry of Environment and its Department of Forest Protection. The story is a group of really courageous women among the poorest, the marginalized population that are living around that forest, went and took seriously the management plan of the forest, which give space to the surrounding population to use a part of that forest in a sustainable way. So those women managed to get a good win-win deal, which is getting a slot of the forest, which was basically exploited as a garbage dump, and to transform it into a very small farm for agriculture production. And from there, the story started, where UNDP and the government, the Ministry of Environment, came up to support them. The idea, and the first one, is how those women will benefit and create an added value from their production, using the new techniques of sustainable production, using a good, a rational way of using water, using the renewable energy, as well as producing the highest value product that can be integrated in the added value, chain added value for them. And here, and particularly during the COVID pandemic, where those ladies, those women was not able to access to market, when we can find the digital opportunities to support them, to access as well to the e-marketing platforms that can help them to place and to sell their product. But the project was still and really centered on those women, how we can really get them better revenues, that they can really raise their children, their families, and to contribute to their social own protection, as well as how we can support them to access better to the existing social protection tools that are existing, but they couldn't access to them. And here, that nexus, that bridge with the administration, with the municipalities, with the Ministry of Social Affairs and Women came in the project. So we started from one group of women. We're now at 8 groups of women, and really not only women that are now asking to be part of the project, but as well young people that are looking at that really nice project, creating a huge interest because we are socially protecting the population and protecting the forest. So the triple dividend from that project, which is social protection, climate change adaptation of the forest, and green and digital economy, could be a good lesson learned that we are trying to capture and to support the government to develop a scaling up strategy where the partnership will be a very important part, where financing should be discussed, where bringing the private sector, tourism opportunities and other opportunities that can help to enlarge and to sustain this project toward the achievement of the SDGs. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alawi, for elaborating on the particular program that you have been overseeing and for explaining to us the triple dividends of the program, and also the effort to really scale up and go beyond the first group of women and include others. And then I hope that during the discussion you can also perhaps reflect a little bit also on the sustainability of this effort. As you move forward with it in going to scale. If I can now, first of all, thank you everyone for having posed more questions in the Q&A box. Keep the questions coming, I think that's good, and then we will have a good selection to pick from and allow our panelists to respond to them. And I would like now to move to the second part of our panel. Several of the speakers so far have already referred to the importance of social dialogue and the very critical role that representatives of workers and employers play in making just transitions inclusive and just and peaceful. And I think they obviously, it's great to have two representatives to be able to speak to us about their perspectives, one from the employers organization and one from workers organization. First of all, I would like to welcome Mr. Robert Marinkovic, who is an advisor for SDGs and the green economy to the International Organization of Employers, IOE. And I would like to ask Mr. Marinkovic to perhaps highlight for us the core expectations that you have and the role that you would like to see employers play in relation to climate change and the just transition. And perhaps you can focus in particular on the role that you see for employers in low-income countries. So over to you, Mr. Marinkovic, for your response. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. Very interesting session so far. I would just like to highlight the fact that we heard a lot of good examples and information so far. First of all, I'd like to say that this is a pretty, I think we can all agree, it's a pretty complicated topic, and there's a lot to unpack, and it's hard to come up with a complete answer in 5 minutes. But one point that was mentioned before was that social protection is quite heterogeneous in the world right now, and there's very variable levels of existing social protection. So I think one important point to keep in mind is to focus on those areas and regions that where the progress to be made is relatively obvious. We have some data like 55% of people don't have adequate social protection and things like that. And in this area, we already have existing tools and frameworks that can guide us in action. So for example, the ILO has the relatively recent recommendation on social protection floors, which was adopted in a tripartite manner in 2012, which outlines a lot of important principles and the way forward. And then another important aspect to take into account is also the recommendation on the transition from the informal to the formal economy, because I think there's definitely an important link between informality and social protection floors that needs to be taken into account in any action. A lot of low-income countries don't have adequate social protection floors, and one of the comments mentioned, what can we do in those countries? Well, personally, I feel like, tackling informality could be a way of creating synergies. If we transition people from the informal to the formal sector, then we create more funds and we create more financing for things like social protection. So that's definitely, I think, a big part of the puzzle is looking at informal sectors and how we can bring them into the formal sector. And here we can think about incentives. If somebody's in the informal sector, we have to think about why they're in the informal sector and how we can incentivize them to become part of the formal sector and start benefiting from official schemes like social protection. And then I would also like to mention quickly some of the examples people have already brought in, like public works and payments for environmental services and ecosystem services and things like that. I feel like are definitely an element to the answer. It's slightly innovative ways of creating financing and creating economic activity, which definitely has a role to play. And then it's important to keep in mind always the national specificities and national context, like we see the European Union, for example, with the Green Deal and the Just Transition Fund. They're making big moves in this space and putting in place all sorts of instruments and tools to create this just transition. Then we also have older examples, for example, like the country of Norway with their sovereign state fund, sovereign wealth fund, which has been accumulating wealth for the past 30 years due to their oil production. Well, now they have a very powerful tool to ensure any sort of transition they would like in their country. In countries where we don't have that, we have to be more innovative and think of public-private partnerships and development funding, etc. For employers specifically, I think it's important to keep in mind the difference between this kind of passive social protection, active social protection. And I feel like employers have the biggest role to play in the active part. So that's more about, skills schemes, retraining, increasing employability of different populations and ensuring that people have access to quality jobs and ensuring a dynamic labor market. Once somebody is not employed, they're not officially related to an employer. So I feel like there it is harder for the employers to have a direct impact. It's more about government regulations and bringing employers into the conversation and seeing how they can provide any sort of services or help. And in that sense, there are examples out there, like in Switzerland, for example, people who are unemployed sometimes have access to employment opportunities, which are funded in a shared way between government and employer. So the employer gets an incentive to hire somebody who's currently unemployed, and the government provides that incentive. So you can think about things like that in green sectors. There's many ways of setting things up, and like we've heard from the Egyptian example and the Jamaican example, some countries are definitely making moves and progress, which can provide inspiration to all of us. And there's also plenty of other countries doing things. There was lots of reports about the Philippines and the things they've put in place after tsunami. And then employers, I think small and medium businesses definitely need support, and they need clear regulations, and they need incentives to change things. That's my 5-minute timer, so I'll stop soon. But bigger corporations can definitely lead the way, and some of them already are. Just as an example, I can share some links and documents later on that could be put in the report for people to see. But big, even big oil companies like Eni, for example, they are starting to create official just transition frameworks. And the first thing to do is to start looking at climate risks. So just like the government is developing frameworks to include business and workers and everybody, so companies also need to, the first step is to assess their climate risks and see how they are exposed. There's a London School of Economics project in investing in a just transition. So they looked at, the exposure and the vulnerability of different economic sectors in the UK. So once you start building this kind of information, people can assess it. They can have a discussion. They can have, partnerships and social dialogue, etc., to determine what are the possible actions and how this can be tackled together. Because last message, it's definitely a problem that requires a holistic solution and that requires everyone's involvement. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Marinkovic. And indeed, we are running very short of time. So I'd like to move swiftly to our next panelist and final panelist. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Montserrat Mir Roca, if I can say that as well, who's the Senior Advisor for the Just Transition Center of the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC. And it's great to have you with us, Ms. Mir, and I would like to maybe ask you to express in very few words the significance of social protection for workers, including for those who are in the informal and rural economies in the context of just transitions and climate change. So I'm handing over to you for your comments. Thank you, Ms. Mir.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I hope that you can listen to me. Thank you to organize this interesting panel, because as you know, the ITUC now have two big initiatives, two big campaigns, and one is totally very close and linked to the topic of today, because we are pushing for to have a universal social protection fund as a solidarity measure. Because we are watching that social protection, as you know, is an internationally recognized human right and is a fundamental component of decent work. When we talk about just transition, because today we mix the two topics, we think and we declare that just transition is based on social dialogue between workers and employers, and often governments and sometimes communities. In an ideal world, just transition will mean that everyone have social protection, the topic of today, all jobs are decent, emissions are low at zero, gender equality is a reality, poverty is eliminated, and communities are thriving and resilient. That is not the case really today. And we know that globally, 1.2 million jobs, 40% of the total world employment depend on a stable and healthy environment. And now with the COVID crisis, we are confronting these two big impacts on jobs. And not only on the jobs that maybe will be lost during the pandemic, also that the jobs that will be impacted by the climate change effects, impacts that we are watching every day around the world. And in order to deal with this, we must have universal social protection in place in combination with skills training, redeployment measures and public investment in new and climate-friendly jobs. Because not all the jobs that we see that now we are creating are good jobs. And that is to return to the old schemes that base our economy on the low labor cost. It's not that what we want, and it's that why we are fighting on this. What do we mean by universal social protection is the question that you addressed to me. And we are speaking about all people having access to adequate income support, decent jobs with good income, services when they need the rises, such when they are unemployed, that is a situation today in many parts of the world, and also when they are ill, when they have a child, when they lose the family, or when they become into poverty. Social protection was important before, but this crisis and the devastating loss of worker jobs and livelihoods have resulted from it, and has reaffirmed how essential is the social protection in the just transition. Because we think that due to the need to reduce emissions, there will be a lot of sectors that will be strongly impacted, not only the mining sector as usual, also the transport, the construction, all the sectors will be strongly impacted. And we need to create good jobs to offer good lives and good possibilities to those workers. And it's important also to extend the social protection schemes, because the ITUC fully supports the extension of social protection to workers in the informal economy, because we have, if not, we have a division into our societies. We are watching now that in member states that they have a very well structured social protection schemes with good social dialogue architecture is the ones that are resisting better the impacts of the crisis, the climate and the COVID. And that's why we are proposing to extend the social protection to the informal economy. And also we have good examples on this, because you are asking me how we can show that that is possible. We have examples, empirical examples, that extending social protection to informal workers, such in Uruguay, in Republican Dominica, and in Nepal. Those extensions can play a positive role in encouraging these workers to formalize, and it can help to strengthen the overall financing base for social protection. We must know that now that we are identifying the countries that they have good social protection schemes, we are watching that there are countries in the world, the 50% of the countries, they don't have social protection schemes that cover all the population. And we are watching that, for example, in Asia and in the Americas, the number increase. That's why we think that we need to rebuild the social contract, means to put people at the center, to put the social dialogue at the center, because we follow the ILO guidelines, we will follow the Paris Agreement commitments, and at the same time, we will follow the general knowledge that without social protection is not possible a just transition. This is trying to summarize what we are now doing. But the focus is social dialogue as a key element, several of my antecessors have mentioned, and to rebuild the social contract, to provide trust, and is a solidarity mission to extend the rights to the workers, independent if they are rural, informal, or in Asia, or in America, or in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Montserrat. Thank you for that intervention. And as I feared, we have run out of time. So I think if you allow me, although we've had some really interesting questions being posed by the members of the public, I'm not going to have the time to ask them to pose the questions themselves. So I'm just going to pick up 3 or 4 questions and read them out, and then request each of you to answer maybe one of the questions. So I'm going to start first with a question that we had from Geneviève Tardieu from the ATD Fourth World. And they're asking a really important question, I think, which we have already referred to, and this is around the whole financing question. So the question is, how do we ensure that social protection is accessible to people or countries that cannot mobilize their own resources to contribute to it? So what are we going to do about investing in social protection systems in countries that don't have the necessary finances? That's question 1. Question 2, we have a question about from Rosalie Keach, who's asking where social protection or climate sustainability efforts are lacking by governments. What mechanisms would you advise NGOs and civil society organizations can deploy to change the paradigm? In other words, if the governments are not taking action, what can civil society do to push them into taking action? So maybe one of you would like to pick up on that question. We have a question from Bruno de Sekelier, I'm sorry if I'm torturing your name, who's asking that I'm not hearing very much, he's saying, about on adapting social assistance. I'm hearing a lot about adapting social assistance and shock responsiveness of social protection. Those are great issues, but isn't just transition also about investing in labor market policies, i.e. creating greener jobs, or in ensuring quality health infrastructures, so beforehand, which we could have greatly reduced the impact of a pandemic like the one we've just had? So isn't it important to also invest in health systems? So, and also having to be able to greatly reduce the impact of a pandemic as this one. And then I have another question, if one of you would like to pick up on that one, from Dusu Jabula, who's saying, having in consideration the many problems we face, is the green economy model enough, or the only one to ensure a socially just transition? So we have one question about the green economy. Is that the only model that we have? There's another question about what about labor market policies that are needed? Maybe one of our social partners can pick up on that question. And then we had the question on financing that was posed, and then the role of civil society. So would you like to come in, anyone, to answer those questions? I'm not going to put you on the spot. So colleagues, please unmute if you want to pick up one of those questions. Anyone for the first question on financing?
Yeah, I can start because I was talking about financing.
Yeah, Katerina, can you please talk about financing, but very brief, because we have very little time. So it's really key messages, very briefly.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Yes, great question, of course, and big challenge, I agree. I think in general, it is the role of national governments to support social protection. I mean, I think it should be the role of national governments, but I also see that it's not always possible. So I think international partners can come in and at least temporarily financing part of the system, some of the programs, but it should always go along with the gradual increase of countries' own efforts to fund it. And I think there is some opportunities also. If we link to an adaptive social protection system, we can link even humanitarian funding, DRM funding, actually through that system to respond to shocks. But I mean, as I said, and I think we need to think of new ways and ideas of how to do that, like the CO2 taxes, etc. But I agree it's a challenge, but every country has more money normally on social protection than they think they have. So it's also a policy decision in the first place. And then I think in some cases, international partners still can come in, and COVID again showed the world how important social protection is. So it might also be useful for funding, even though in the short term, everybody has budget constraints, but maybe in the medium term.
Okay, thank you very much for that very succinct response. So there's, yes, there is a role for international cooperation and international partners, but also I think really important point about efforts for domestic resource mobilization through, for example, domestic taxes, income taxes, wealth taxes, but also global efforts like CO2 taxes, not to be forgotten. Anyone for any of the other questions? Maybe the question on the role of civil society if governments are not being responsive, or maybe also if anyone would like to pick up the question about labor market policies, about creation of green jobs and role of social partners. Anyone on that? Montserrat, do I see you nodding? Yeah. Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Shara. I think that is, again, as Katarina says, there is an important part of political decision. It's an opportunity. We are confronting a big opportunity because sometimes crises are big opportunities to change completely our labor markets, not only to place the role of work as the discussion of the ILO last year in the Centenary, the role of the work in our societies, but so also to show that it's possible to use the money in a more efficient manner and to create quality jobs. Now is the moment. It's more easy to invest and more efficient to invest in green jobs and jobs that are decent jobs, as we understand, with good wages, with social protection. And we need to encourage governments to not see as a cost, to not see as expenditure. This is a good investment that could change completely and could attract more people to the labor market. Of course, there is an important investment, public and private, on skills, and we will need a lot of money to reskill the people, to skill the people that will enter in the labor markets after this crisis. But it's more efficient 10 times and also could create growth, because as Katarina says, why not to use the taxes on the CO2 to create these funds that will contribute to have better jobs and reshape the labor market. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Montserrat. Anyone else would like to pick up on any of the questions that have been posed?
Yes,
yes, please come in. Please come in. Yeah, come in.
Yes. if I cannot add on the financing issue, I think in many cases, it's not a matter of the existing money. Sometimes it's a coordination issue. A lot of donors, a lot of money are used, but what we need is an integrated framework to finance the SDGs. And we have now a good framework to do that. And COVID is reminding us that we have to put more priority on social protection and on health, on education issues. And I can bridge that and link that to the role of civil society. I think here the civil society have a great role to play, to advocate, to show cases, to raise the voice of those people marginalized, the left behind, and to give them that power to be on the table of the ministers, on the tables of parliament, as well as to raise their voice with the big businesses that are, taking the best benefit from the resources of the countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al-Kabir. Do I see anyone else wanting to come in? Any of the other speakers?
Yeah,
yes,
I was just going to come in on the civil society question. I do think that it's also context specific in terms of it depends where the civil society is and sort of understanding the sort of political economy, for a lack of a better word, within the context you're operating in, and then making sure that you're using every opportunity and any allies you have. You may have allies within government, you may have allies within the sort of donor or the UN system, you may have allies, and often is local communities where often there are traditional local social protection systems already in place, and building buy-in for that system. And I think it's also taking a sort of immediate, but actually a longer term perspective to civil society intervention. So looking at also development ministers meeting or Minister of Finance meeting globally, but also then bringing it back to dialogue, social media, radio, different communication mechanisms to have discussion and create awareness and understanding around that social protection to start off is a right and an investment, along with education and health, that is critical for resilience and sustainability of communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. I now really do need to wrap up the session, and unless there are any burning issues others would like to raise, I want to take the few minutes that I hope we still have to really thank, first of all, I want to thank our partner, the government of Switzerland, for having co-organized this side event with us at the Commission for Social Development. I want to thank in particular Mr. Hauri, Ms. Risden, as well as Ms. Berser-Bircher for their very illuminating opening remarks. I want to ask our dear panelists, I want to really thank our dear panelists. I can now call you, I hope, by your first names. Eileen, for having been here with us. Sonia, for your perspectives coming from Kenya and the concrete experiences in the country of bringing social protection and climate action together. Katerina, for your reflections coming from the GIZ and your studies on just transitions and social protection in the context of just transitions. Al-Kabir, for your very concrete reflections based on the experience in Senegal. And I also want to thank our friends from our IOE and ITUC, Robert from IOE and Montserrat from ITUC, for having shared your reflections. It was a great panel and great opportunity to have you all in this space. And I hope that the discussions, you will be watching it on live TV, UN TV, and also we will get some nice tweets on it in social media. And thank you all for your time and for your time in preparing and being part of this conversation. So I wish you all a good rest of day, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you very much from the ILO team. Goodbye.
And let's thank you, Shara, for that
Thank you.
great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye.